Hello and welcome back to the Evangelize Me YouTube channel. I'm Don Smith, and we're going to continue our series on preparing for the Advent. Hey, we had a plan. I threw out the plan. Now we have a new plan. The new plan is to extend the class by 4 weeks. We're going to add a new class on Romans chapter 1 because I think it's really important. I've referenced it in almost every one of these little classes that we've been doing. And I think it's important that we really dig into Romans 1 so that we can understand biblically what is going on in our culture and in the world. And then instead of just having one class on what we need to do or what we need to be able to embrace this change that's going on, I've decided to spread that out a little bit more. So we're going to continue on for a little bit longer, and last week was the Great Tribulation. And this week we're going to be looking at some more depressing stuff. So I thought we ought to spend more time looking at good stuff, right? We want to balance this out. So anyway, what I'm going to do right now is segue into a different format and show you a timeline. And you're not going to be able to see it very well, and that's okay, because I don't think the people in the class would see it very well. But what I'm trying to do is to establish a visual way of seeing history so that we can appreciate how different things are today than they have been in the past. So let's go do that. Okay, welcome to the timeline. I know you can't see it, but trust me, it's going to be okay, because basically what I'm trying to do is just give you a visual image of human history on this planet, right? And so you don't really need to be able to see it. I'll tell you what you're looking at. The big thing that I just want you to see is the amount of time that this takes place in, right? And to be able to compare so that we can understand this idea of seasons that we're in the context of all of human history. And so way over here, we have 2500 BC. Right, in 2500 BC, the pyramid, the Great Pyramid in Giza is being built. Just to give you context. Now, every inch equals 20 years. And basically what I did was, at the top, I listed some cultural events so that we could have a context. In the middle, I did kind of church, religious, Bible things. At the bottom, in red, I made technology and inventions. And of course, it comes all the way over here, and this is today. So you just think I'm 61 years old. My life is in the last 6 inches, right? Make sense? So let me just quickly go over the cultural things so that you have like a little context. So you have, the pyramid being built, like I mentioned. You have the Stonehenge being completed in England. You have the Sun Pyramid being built in Mexico around 1500 BC. You have the Trojan War, you have King Tut in Egypt. The Trojan Wars, the first Olympics, Rome being founded, the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire. Right here, just beyond the center, is Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, where we start over, right? Just before that, we start over at his birth. 0. Jerusalem getting destroyed. The Mayan Empire in Mexico is growing. Rome falls in 410. You have the Vikings. You have the Vikings coming to Canada. You have Marco Polo. You have the Black Plagues in Europe. You have Columbus discovering America, 1492. You have the founding of the United States. Pretty significant, right? Because it's the first modern democracy founded on a totally different principle of human rights given to us by God, being ruled by the people, for the people. Totally different premise from all the other governments for hundreds of years. You have the Civil War, and then some other events, world wars, all that stuff. We'll get into those in more details later on. In the middle, you have Abraham. You have the Exodus. You have Joshua, King Saul, King David, King Solomon, the exile under the Babylonian rule, the return to Jerusalem, the Maccabean revolt, again, Jesus' death and resurrection, the Edict of Milan, which is really significant because it provided religious freedom in the Roman Empire. For the first time, Christians could practice their faith without fear of persecution. The Nicene Council, the scriptures being translated into Latin, the Vulgate, Pope Gregory the Great, who basically rebuilt Europe after Rome falls, Charlemagne, the emperor of the great Roman Empire, not the Roman Empire, shoot. Come on, Don. The Holy Roman Empire, that's what it's called. The East-West Schism between Catholics and Orthodox. The First Crusade, the building of Notre Dame in Paris, Thomas Aquinas, Joan of Arc, the Reformation, and then we have the modern stuff that we'll look at later. So now let's do, and this is, I think, the really significant thing. This is the thing that kind of sets off this season from all the other times in human history, right? And that is the technological developments. And so you come back here, and right around the time that Stonehenge is being built, horses are domesticated. Okay? I'm sure that was a life-changing event to be able to have an animal that is able to do work for you and that you're able to ride and use to pull a wagon, right? Huge, huge thing, getting horses domesticated. Well, 500 years later, the alphabet's developed. 500 years later, you have silk being produced by the Chinese. They figured out how to do that. In around 1200, we figured out how to work with iron. And again, with all of these things, what it means, the date is the beginning of it, but it's really like it takes time for it to be developed and processed and for it to spread and to become in common usage, right? So iron in 1200. You come up, this one's just kind of silly, another 500-year gap. False teeth, I'm sure that was really important, but the first set of false teeth supposedly are about 700 BC. This one's kind of significant, 200 years before Christ. Papers developed in China. Up until then, you had to use papyrus or animal skins to write on, or you could write on clay and then dry it in the sun, stuff like that. So now, paper. Now, I want you to notice, there's a huge gap here, right? Between paper and gunpowder, 1,000 years goes by where there's not any significant changes. And then you have gunpowder, and 150 years later, you have the development of windmills. And then another 150 years later, you have the development of a compass, so that you could use, if it was cloudy and you couldn't see the stars, you could still figure out where you were going. And then when you get to 1250, you have the development of the mechanical clock. Well, that's kind of surprising, right? So that means up until 1250, and of course, again, you have this idea of like, okay, just because the clock was invented doesn't mean that it was instantly in, all over the world in everybody's house, right? Actually, for hundreds of years, it was only found in cathedrals, in big cities, or in palaces where kings could show off how rich they were. And so in 1250, that means that for all of this time, thousands of years, no one knew what time it was, and nobody cared what time it was. All you need to do is like mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, evening, right? Nobody was looking at watches every 10 minutes. Nobody was looking at their clock saying, oh my gosh, I only have 10 minutes to get there. Isn't that amazing, right? So for all of this time, that was not a concern for human beings at all. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so that's in 1250. In 1455, printing is developed. And so you're going to stop again. It says like, okay, so from this period all the way back to the beginning, if you wanted anything written down, and you had to hand copy it. You had to handwrite it, and you had to hand copy it. That's why for hundreds of years, you had monks who dedicated their entire lives to copying the scriptures, handwriting scriptures by candlelight and lanterns. That's the only way you could get a copy of the Bible, is to get these monks to spend years hand copying them, right? And so now, 1455, all of a sudden, we figured out how to put ink on paper in a mechanical way so that we could print books. So if that's right there, and so then about 100 years later, 1765, no, actually it's more than that, it's 300 years later, 1765, and this is the beginning of a huge change, the development of the steam engine. So you think about, okay, so here's a steam engine. Of course, it's 1765 is when it's invented, so it takes, again, time for it to be, figured out and implemented and used in a widespread way. But that means that from this time, I want you to notice, that's within a foot, just about, of our modern day, 1765. That means that for all of this time, from all the way back, if you had work to be done, you either had to use your own muscles, you had to use the muscles on an animal, like a horse or an ox, or you had to have like a stream, a water wheel, or wind power. All of those years, and then in 1804, the railroad is developed. And again, this is 1804, so you got to think about like how much work it would be to build the tracks. They had to standardize the rail sizes. They had to build the locomotives. They had to build the steam engines that drove the locomotives and build the cars that carried them. All of that stuff, huge production. 1804, up until 1804, right here. Before that, for all of time, you wanted to go anywhere, you either went on foot or horseback or wagon. Or I suppose if you were in a boat, you could sail. Or, row it, I guess, but that didn't sound like much fun. So you think about what is normal for human beings? It's normal in the whole history of human beings. In the human experience, what's normal is it takes a long time to go anywhere. So now this phenomenal thing happens where it's like, wow, we have a railroad track now that goes from New York to Chicago. And you can get there in a few days, right? Rather than months of walking or riding a horse or taking a wagon. I mean, this has profoundly changed. And that's this right here. And then like 1807, the steamboats developed. First time we're not dependent on wind or needing to row boats. And then in 1831, really significant development is the development of the invention of the reaper. Okay, so I just want you to think about 1831. And a reaper is a way of harvesting, cutting grains. So you figure oats, wheat, barley, hay. Up until 1831, it all had to be harvested by hand. Right, so you got to think about that. Like, okay, so that means that for all of these years, to be able to have bread, flour to make bread, someone had to go out on the field, and you think, okay, just a 5-acre field. And think about it, going out to a 5-acre field and having to cut it all by hand. Okay, so maybe some of you can't relate to that. Let's say it's a 1-acre field. Maybe it's about the size of a house lot, right? And you had to mow your lawn by hand, right? No, like not with a mechanical push mower, No, like you had like a little hand saw and you had to cut the grass, the entire grass on 1 acre. That would take a long time, right? But then you have to, if you're doing grain, of course, you'd have to gather the grain and bundle it up, put it in a wagon, take the wagon to the barn, and then you'd have to thresh it, which is removing the grain from the stalks. Then you'd have to take the grain to the mill and have the mill ground up so that you could get your flour. Now you need to understand, that was normal human life until 1831. Normal human life for thousands of years was hand harvesting grain and hand threshing it and hand grinding it so that you could have flour to make bread. Okay, so you just see, we have no idea. We go to the grocery store and we grab a loaf of bread. You know, we paid, $2 for it or $3 for it. We have no idea what a loaf of bread meant for human beings for almost all of human history. See, that's my point. We have no clue how different our time is from all the rest of time in human history. So I want you to keep that in mind, because we're going to be looking at, the telephone and the telegraph and and all of these inventions that happened. And I'll take a picture so that I can put it up of all the red at the end. Like here, it starts out like every 500 years. Then when you get up here, it's like every 50 years. Every 100 years you get a new development. And over here, it's like, railroads, 1804, steamboats, 1807, reaper, 1831, telegraph, 1844. Just bang, 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 bang. How did that happen? I mean, steam engine, 1765. We discovered iron in 1200. And surely they knew about boiling water, right? So why did it take so long? If we knew how to work iron back here, and we knew how to boil water, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's that complicated to be able to use steam to move a piston, to move something, right? And then all of a sudden, there's this just explosion of technology. Remember the context. Jesus says you should know the season you live in. All right, let's go back to our PowerPoint. All right, welcome back. So we've already talked about some of these things, the development of the steam engine, the railroad, the steamboat, the reaper. I think that's where we left off out there. The electric light in 1879. And, even though it was 1879, like I said, when I was doing the timeline, these things take time to get actually in use in a broader way. And so by 1925, less than 100 years ago, half the homes in the United States still did not have electricity. Less than 100 years ago, right? I mean, like today, if we lose power and it's been more than like 20 minutes, we start freaking out and be like, well, where's CMP? What's wrong with them, right? We can't survive without electricity now. And yet, remember that timeline, right? For thousands and thousands of years, if you wanted light after the sun went down, you lit a candle or a lantern, right? I was visiting with an elderly lady up in Jay this past week, and she grew up in Sumner, Maine, which is kind of in the western mountains of Maine, and even today there's not much out there. And she said she remembered when electricity came to their farm in 1949, and how life-changing that was that they had electricity in 1949, right? And so, again, 1885, the development of the automobile. Now, we talked a little bit when we were doing the timeline about the railroad, but you still had horses and buggies. In fact, my grandfather, and of course, that development of the automobile, but then it took a lot longer for it to actually go into production and be able to be distributed and all of those things. My grandfather owned the blacksmith shop on Sweden Street in Caribou. Big barn. It was still there when I was a kid. So when and it was a livery stable too. So when you brought your horse in, you could leave your horse with my grandfather while you did your shopping and your errands and all of that stuff. Went to church, whatever, and then you could pick up your horse and head home. And if they needed shoes or whatever, then he could do that too. And of course, when automobiles came to northern Maine, which was significantly later than 1885. Like you're talking the 1930s. Blacksmiths weren't needed anymore. First airplane, 1903. First commercial flight, 1914, that was a flight from one side of Florida to the other. But back then, I mean, that doesn't seem like a very big flight, but driving from one side of Florida to the other in an automobile would take about 10 hours, take even longer with a horse and buggy, right? And the flight could do it in less than 2 hours. Pretty significant. I'm sure that, not a lot of people did it because I'm sure it wasn't cheap. Rockets, 1926. In the medical world, ether was first used by a dentist as anesthesia in 1842. Okay, now I want you to picture that timeline. 1842 is really near the end. That means for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, most of human history, you were in pain, right? I mean, the best they probably had was alcohol. Actually, when I was reading about that, it said some doctors just knocked their patients out, like literally smashed them on the back of the head and knocked them unconscious. Otherwise, you'd have to hold them down while you were trying to do surgery. That wouldn't work, right? Well, actually, that's what they did. I mean, it says 1842, but we know during the Civil War, it wasn't in common use during that, right? Because that's what you bite the bullet, right? You get held down, you bite the bullet, and somebody cuts your leg off. I mean, we have no clue how different our world is. Germs were discovered 1857, X-rays 1895, penicillin 1928, CAT scan 1975, and MRI 1977. But, it says 1977, but again, I needed an MRI in Maine in 1987, 10 years later, and there was only one MRI machine in the whole state of Maine, right? DNA was discovered in 1952. The first clone, 1996. Now in 2012, we have gene editing. We know how to remove genes and of course, and replace them. Of course, this is a really amazing thing because if the problem is with the gene is causing a disease and you can go in and remove the damaged gene or the mutant gene or whatever it is and replace it with something healthy, and cure a disease, that's really amazing, right? Miraculous. But of course, it's as with everything, there's kind of the negative side of it. I want a blonde-haired baby. I want a female, not a male. I want it to grow 6 feet tall. I want soldier material, some big muscles. It's really smart. Communication's kind of fascinating. Telegraph, 1844. Okay, so again, until 1844, and probably after that, if you wanted a message sent to anyone, anywhere, even if it was just over the hill, you either had to take it yourself, or you had to find somebody who was willing to take it for you. Or you had to pay somebody to take it for you, right? I mean, this is, during the Civil War, there was a big deal that President Lincoln could get down to the telegraph office and wait to hear what happened during a battle from his generals. And that's what he'd do. He'd know there's a big battle going on. He'd go and sit at the telegraph office waiting to hear. Did we win? Did we lose? How many people did we lose? I can remember I loved Civil War history and spent many years just, reading about different battles and different generals and different personalities. And how many battles there were where, the general's up on a hilltop so he can see his entire army and they're in the field and the edge of the woods and he'd want to send a message to a general that's like a mile and a half away. And so he'd write out the orders and then he'd hand it to a messenger and he'd send them. And of course, it would take a little while for that horse to get down there. And as the general was watching, a whole Confederate brigade would come out of the woods, and he'd be like, "Oh my gosh! I don't want to move them. I just sent the order. Now I got to send another order." So he'd write it out and hand it. Entire battles were lost because orders didn't get to generals in time. I mean, it's that wasn't that long ago. It's kind of interesting. I read a really interesting book by a French priest, and of course I don't have the book with me, so I can't tell you who he was. But it's about the end of the world. It's a bunch of lectures this priest did in France. Saint Therese read the book when she was 14 years old, and it changed her life. She talked about like that. It's like where she formed her image of heaven and the end of the world and all of that stuff. And so I read that this summer. One of the things that this priest said was like, now that we have the telegraph, we are in the last days, because now, for the first time in history, we can communicate instantaneously thousands of miles away. Of course, you could look at that and say, oh my gosh, those crazy Christians, right? Always looking for the end of the world. That Don Smith, he's always looking for the end of the world. Or you could look at it in this context where it's like, oh, geez, that wasn't that long ago. And you know what? He was right. It was the beginning of the end of the world. It's up to you. Telephone, 1876. It sounds like it's really early. That's the first phone call. But when I was a kid in 1965, 66, 68, I don't know, in Caribou, we had a phone, but it was a party line, so it'd ring once if it was the neighbors, twice if it was us, three times if it was the other neighbors. So you'd pick it up and there'd be people talking. You'd have to put it down and wait until they get off the phone so that you could make a call. It wasn't telephones the way that we understand telephones today. Radio, 1901. Think how bizarre that was for those people who could turn on a radio and listen to someone talking, listen to the president, fireside chat, right? It was like, that's almost miraculous for the first time somebody hears it, right? It's like, oh my gosh, the president, he's talking in Washington, D.C., and I can hear him in Maine. That's just bizarre. Television, color TV, 1954. And again, this is just by way of example, 1964, only 2% of people had color TVs. My wife tells a story, about, being a little kid and having the program come on and it'll say, in living color. And she'd say, oh my gosh, it's going to be in color. And her parents would be like, no, it's not going to be in color. We don't have a color TV, right? Computers, 1937. Imagine how big that thing was. When I went to University of Maine in Orono in 1980, the computer took up an entire room. And the way that you programmed the material into, I did data entry for this computer. I was pretty tech savvy too, because you had these little cards and you slide the card into a slot and you'd push you enter the data in on a keyboard, and then you'd push a button and it would punch holes in the card, and then you take the card out and put it in a slot. And then you'd do like 1,000 or 1,200 of those cards, and then you'd feed the cards into the computer, and then you'd wait a couple of days, and it would spit out the statistics and information that you had entered onto those cards. It was profound technology. Transistors, obviously, that was changing. Portable phones, PCs, phones without, internet, phones with no antenna. No exterior antenna, And then, of course, the development of the internet, where now we hear, I have a news app. So I get a little, ding, and I look at it, and it's like there was an earthquake in Peru. Hundreds of people dead. Why do I need to know that, right? And why do I need to know it like it happened 10 minutes ago? You think about, okay, for thousands and thousands of years, you didn't know what was going on anywhere in the world except probably what was in your own town. And then you might read it in the newspaper a week later. It's like, oh, so-and-so was elected president. Isn't that amazing? We have instantaneous news of every horrid event that takes place in the world. We have instantaneous news in full color, dramatically presented to us every day, all day. Every lunatic that kills somebody, every bus that goes off the road and little children are hurt. Everything now. We have it all in our pocket. We have more computing power in our cell phone than they had on the Apollo mission that went to the moon. Insane. So one of the concepts that we talked about last week was this idea that that the end of the world, this is kind of a worldwide event that takes place, right? This, like the idea of some sort of authority or government having a worldwide authority. And we talked about the idea of the pandemic, and we talked about global warming and some sort of global crisis that would require a global authority. And so I just want you to think for a minute. 1917, very significant year. It was the beginning of World War I. So World War I, there's a reason why we call it World War, right? It's the first time in the history of the world that that many nations participated on many different continents. I mean, there's always been war, right? You know, there's been crusades, there's been civil wars, there's been conquering armies. But for the first time now, because of technology, now that we have tanks and airplanes and ships, now we can wage war anywhere and everywhere, all at the same time. And then, of course, 1917 is the rise of the first communist government in the history of the world, the Russian Revolution, which eventually becomes the Soviet Union. And then 1917, very significantly, you have our Blessed Mother talking to some children in Portugal. And part of the message that she brings to them at Fatima is what is going on in Russia at the same time, which is kind of bizarre. I mean, what do these little shepherd children in Portugal know about what is going on in Russia? And yet, the mother is giving them this message about how important Russia is going to be in these coming decades. Fascinating. And then, of course, you have, right after World War I, it's this, horrendously bloody, millions of people killed. And so they formed the League of Nations. For the first time in the history of the world, hundreds of nations come together to make agreements on, okay, this is how we're going to conduct warfare now. These are the rules of engagement. This is how we're going to do trade. This is how we're going to resolve conflicts. First time, right? And then you have the Communist Revolution in China. And then 1940, you have World War II, which was fought on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica, as far as I know. And after that, they dissolved the League of Nations and founded the United Nations. More countries involved, more authority is given to the United Nations to be able to hold courts and to be able to make up rules. Of course, the founding of the EU in 1993. So you can see this, okay, again, you just go back and say, this isn't very long ago, right? The founding of the United Nations, 1945. One of the things that's not in this list, which is on the timeline, is that in 1948, Israel becomes a nation again. So you go back, if you can imagine the timeline, from 70 AD, when Jerusalem gets destroyed and Israel is no longer a nation, until 1948, this tremendous thousands of years, Israel does not exist. And now, 1948, all of a sudden there's a nation of Israel. The Jewish people are restored to their homeland. That's a significant event, right? Especially in context of what we were talking about last week in the conversion of the Jews. All right, so I wanted to give you a context also for what is going on in the world today and how different it is when it comes to morality. So, in 1953, Hugh Hefner published Playboy magazine, the very first issue. It was a men's entertainment magazine. It was the first time pornography had been widely distributed in the history of the world. I mean, there had been pornographic images and erotic art, things like that. But the first time a magazine had been printed with, nudity and widely distributed to a very large population. 1953. Of course, it started out like very subtle, right? Somewhat subtle. Had Marilyn Monroe. She was a famous actress. She was the sweetheart of the month. You had an interview with the Dorsey brothers, a big band, big jazz band. You had articles on food and drinks and articles on sports. And you had an article on desk designs for the modern office. I mean, it was meant to be like, this is about, educated men and classy men. But it opened the door right? It opened the door to the billions of dollars that get spent today on pornography in the world. 1953 it started. Again, it wasn't very long ago. See, one of the things that happens, I think, and we'll see this as we're going through this morality thing, is that it's kind of shocking at first, but then we get used to it, and then it's sort of like, oh yeah, this is normal. It's like, well, no, it's not normal. It's never been normal. It's never been normal to have pornography widely available and accepted in a society for hundreds and thousands of years, and certainly not widely distributed in such a way, right? So the Supreme Court is very involved in a lot of this stuff, and of course the Supreme Court decisions always have a context, a cultural context, historical context, things going on. But I use these dates because I think that's where they really get nailed down, right? And so 1962 is when the Supreme Court decided that people shouldn't pray in school. That it was that was a mixture of the church and state thing, that that we just can't do it anymore. No more prayer in school. In 1965, they made the decision about birth control, which is kind of shocking, because you'd think, like today, we don't think anything of birth control. Well, it's like, everybody uses birth control, right? But the hormonal birth control that we use now, the pill, was developed in the 1950s. It was only available by prescription, and it was only for if you had health reasons that you shouldn't get pregnant, right? Or if you had other health reasons for using it. It wasn't primarily just a general, like, everybody using it, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. But in 1965, the Supreme Court says, oh no, and this is all based on privacy, the idea of anybody should be able to use it. This was a radical change. Now, the interesting thing is that every Christian denomination, up until the 1950s, thought birth control was a sin. Every single one of them, without exception. As it becomes more popular and more widespread, and there's lawsuits, and it ends up in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court makes this decision. Almost every denomination, except for Orthodox and Catholic, as far as I know, said, "Oh yeah, that's fine." The interesting thing is that the Pope wrote an encyclical about it, and it was like, everybody knew this encyclical was going to come out. It was going to be about birth control. Everybody expected the Pope to say, "Oh yeah, don't worry about it." Yeah, that we taught that, but now we don't believe that anymore. And that's not what he said, right? What he said was like, no, we've always believed in this. We're always going to believe in it. Like that's making a choice that human beings shouldn't be able to make. God is the one who makes choices about, the origin of life and each soul that is brought forward. The purpose of sex is for creating babies, and so this idea of let's separate the act of sexuality from making babies. And he says, he actually is very prophetic, this is going to destroy the fabric of the family and society. Shortly after that, no-fault divorces. This is not a Supreme Court decision, but it comes into being that you can get divorced for any reason. Before that, it was if someone had an affair, you could get divorced. If someone had a mental illness, you could get a divorce. If someone was abusive, you could get a divorce. 1969, it was like, what? We don't like each other anymore. Let's get divorced. The number of divorces almost tripled. Totally. That's a huge change, right? From, the 1940s, where the divorce rate is really low, until the 1980s, where it's sky high and almost half of marriages end in divorce. That is a brand new thing. It's a brand new thing. Going back to the Supreme Court, you have birth control. And of course, if you're going to separate sex from having babies, then everybody just wants to have sex, right? And so you have the sexual revolution in the 60s. And even though you have birth control, for some reason, people still get pregnant. And so we have to get a way of getting rid of these pregnancies. And so the Supreme Court, in Roe versus Wade, outlaws or legalizes abortion. Do you see how these are connected? Do you see how like this is a flow? Like one decision leads to this consequence. The consequence leads to the next decision. The next decision leads to a consequence, which makes another decision. We're going to look at that when we do Romans 1 next week. The Ten Commandments were removed from, I put schools, but it's really all public government buildings, courthouses, things like that, 1980. Because, we didn't want people keeping the Ten Commandments anymore. And this is the significant one. In 2003, the Supreme Court said it's illegal to outlaw homosexual behavior. Now, you need to understand that in 1962, when they removed prayer from school, homosexuality was illegal in all 50 states. 1962, homosexuality is illegal in all 50 states, and it's considered a psychiatric disorder, a sociopathic disorder. 2003, just 40 years later, the Supreme Court says homosexuality is fine. Now, one of the things that you need to realize is that from the fall of Rome, okay, so Rome was a very perverse society. From the fall of Rome, after Rome fell, basically the church is what held society together, and the authority of the church is what rebuilt civilization in Europe. And that's why you had Pope Gregory the Great, and you had the Holy Roman Empire. So from the fall of Rome until 2003, from 410 until 2003, pornography and homosexuality hardly existed. I mean, obviously it was always there, but as a culture and a society, it certainly wasn't approved. It wasn't legal. It wasn't accepted. It was frowned upon. It was discouraged. You would be arrested. For 1,600 years, the birth of the greatest, most powerful, innovative, richest countries the world has ever seen was built around this structure that now we are throwing out. And then, of course, in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex, they put it in quotes, marriage, unions, which completely changed the definition of what marriage is. Now, here's the thing with these decisions. That was 2015. This is 2022. That's only 7 years ago. It was a big deal when it was happening. People were protesting. People were upset. Like, oh my gosh, how could they make this decision? 7 years later, you know what? This isn't even an issue anymore. We don't discuss it. We don't talk about it. In fact, it's pretty much normal. 7 short years. And of course, that idea of being normal, what is normal is critically important, right? So you think about a child that was born in 1800, 1820, 1850, somewhere in there. They had if you were born in 1820, you were no doubt born on a farm. You were no doubt born in a large family. You no doubt had a father and mother. Granted, they didn't live as long, but they didn't get divorced very much. You would have had to work really hard on the farm. I mean, you had to do laundry by hand. You had to harvest everything by hand. You had to, take care of animals and collect the eggs and plow, and everything had to be done by hand, right? But you contrast that with a child that's born, say, in the year 2000, where half of marriages end in divorce, and all of these things that are now normal in our culture. It is a totally and completely different world when you think about it technologically, with all the developments and the lights and communication and information. It's a totally different world. Medically, we know, like there's just no comparison. When you compare it morally, it's tragic what we consider normal now. I want to go back just a little bit to 1995. It's not a Supreme Court decision, but I think it's a very significant development. During 1993 and 1994, there were a lot of studies done with teenagers about at-risk behavior. And so one of the studies concluded that like teenagers who smoke are much more likely to be suicidal or depressed. They're much more likely to be involved in violent behavior. They're much more likely to drop out of school. They're much more likely to, if they're females, to get pregnant. They're much more likely, to run away from home. I mean, like all of these, get in trouble with the law. All of these things. Now, of course, we know that smoking doesn't cause those things, right? Because we were talking about the breakdown of the family is really what caused these things. But smoking was one of the things that they could point to and say, this is if you're smoking, that's a risky behavior and it puts you in a risk-taking place. And so the United States government looks at that. This is under Bill Clinton, by the way. U.S. government looks at that and says, okay, we need to make sure that kids aren't smoking, right? So we pass all kinds of laws. You have to be 18 to buy cigarettes. You got to, punish kids who are smoking. You got to do all this stuff. We got to stop teenagers from smoking. Of course, there were health risks too. 1995, another study. Almost the same exact thing. There was this behavior. The behavior resulted in greater suicide and depression rates and anxiety, separation from families, more pregnancies, more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, more likely in trouble with the law. You put the studies side by side, they're almost identical. Tobacco, they say, okay, no more tobacco. The behavior in this one was same-sex attraction. And the U.S. government looked at that and said, now, you would think it's like, okay, well, we ought to discourage children from having same-sex attraction. Like, how could we do that? But that's not what they did. What they did was, we have to help these kids feel normal. Because if they felt normal, then they wouldn't have depression or anxiety or be suicidal or, all these risk-taking alcohol, drug abuse stuff. Which I just want to say has not played out at all, right? Homosexuality now is legal and homosexual people can get married. And we have done all kinds of things to normalize homosexuality in our culture. And yet, when you look at the statistics, people with same-sex attraction have more depression, more anxiety, more drug use, more suicides. This idea of normalizing this behavior to make them feel better has never worked. And I want to say, this is the policy of our culture now. That is why we have this situation with people who are gender confused, and we are told we have to use the pronouns they identify with, because we want them to feel normal. We want them to feel okay about their confusion. 1995 is when that started. It's not that long ago. There was an interview with President Biden just a couple weeks ago, done by a man who, a trans man, he dresses like a woman, does the hormone things, the whole 9 yards. So he's transitioned to living as a woman, even though he's a man. He's a YouTuber. He's not famous. He's not he's not affiliated with any big organizations or news companies. He has a YouTube channel. And he was given a private interview with President Biden at the White House. That's, like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And it was during that interview that Biden said it's immoral not to provide gender-affirming treatment, both chemical hormones as well as surgery, to teenagers who are confused with other genders. It's immoral not to do that. The same guy, about a week after he interviews the president, says he's in a grocery store. He's dressed up like a woman. He's wearing tight tights. And as he's in the store, he realized, like, everybody's looking at his crotch. Because he's a man, right? But he's got tight things on. But he's dressed as a woman. And so he found that very offensive. And he said, like, people are, like, shocked that a woman in a store with tight clothing on has a bulge in their crotch. And so what we need to do is normalize this so that people get used to it. I just want to ask, like, where do you think this normalization is going to stop? I don't think it is, right? I mean, like, they're already talking about intergenerational attraction, right? Which is another way of saying a pedophile. And they're already trying to be like, that used to be a psychological disorder, and it used to be terrible and frowned upon. But, these are good people, and this is just a natural attraction they have, and they can't help it. And what's wrong with it anyway? Why can't they be normal people too? Just in 40 years, 50 years, the moral fabric of our entire culture has been destroyed. Now, I'm making this recording on November 9th, 2002. No, November 8th. I don't know. It's election day. It's the 8th, November 8th. It's election day 2022. And it looks like the Republicans are going to win. And, of course, everybody's excited Republicans are going to win. I'm just going to say this. This is beyond politics. This is beyond politics. Doesn't matter who the president is and who's running Congress. We're not going back on these issues. These issues are in our culture, and they're in our culture to stay for the most part. And they have been normalized. The only way that things are really going to change in our country is if there is a profound outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the Western culture. If that doesn't happen, I want to propose to you that according to the way that Jesus and St. Paul described the last days, I would propose to you that we are there. That when you look at the timeline and you look at how much things have changed in the last 1,400 years, or in the last, actually it's not the 14, how much things were the same for 4,000 years, 4,300 years, and how much things have changed in the last 100 years, and I would propose to you, we are in a different season than anything that's ever been before. And remember, Jesus says, watch, pay attention, so that we can be prepared. Now, I'm not saying Jesus is going to come back anytime soon. I'm not saying he's coming back tomorrow or next week or next year or the next 5 years. He probably won't come back in my lifetime. I don't know. But my children, my grandchildren, that's why we need to prepare. We need to know what these signs are. We need to understand the season that we live in. And we have to be prepared to live out our faith in a world that is hostile to it. And do it not with fear and trembling, but with joy and with hope. And maintaining that hopeful expectation that we talked about of looking forward to the Lord coming. Thanks for joining me. Next week, we're going to look at Romans chapter 1. I pray that God supernaturally fills you with the virtue of hope and faith and love so that you can live in this crazy world that we live in, knowing that your Lord is the King of all creation. And this King of all creation, who has all authority on heaven and earth, he loves you. God bless you. I'll see you next week.